This is lesson 19 the French Revolution, the Revolt against Privilege, 1788 to 1789. And we still have that same question. How did the events of 1789 result in a constitutional monarchy in France, and what were the consequences? And we're still on College Board topic 5.4, French Revolution. We're going to be here for a while. Explain the causes, events, and consequences of the French Revolution. French Revolution resulted from a combination of long-term social and political causes, as well as Enlightenment ideas exacerbated by short-term fiscal and economic crises. So we're still there. And our time frame is 1788 to 1789. We're still in France. And once again, I've used many different sources for these lessons on the French Revolution, but I want to give special recognition again, and not for the last time, to the great courses Living the French Revolution and the Age of Napoleon by Professor Suzanne Desan. You can listen to this book on audible.com. It's well worth it. In 1788, Louis XVI agreed to call an assembly of the Estates General. And that's kind of like our Congress or England's Parliament. In other words, it's a representative body. The king was in effect asking the people to tell him what was wrong in France. And he was also opening the door to sharing power. And he didn't know it at the time, but he was also opening the door to revolution. First, the people of France had to get ready for an Estates General. The Estates General hadn't met since 1614. That's 175 years, and all those representatives were long dead. So the people had to elect new representatives to send to the Estates General. People gathered all over France in all kinds of venues to elect deputies to represent them in the Estates General. So representatives are called deputies. The various three estates that we talked about in the last lesson chose their own deputies to represent not only their regions, but also their particular estates as well, clergy, nobility, or commoners. People also drew up large lists of grievances for their deputies to take to the Estates General with them, and there are about 500 of these grievance lists. Royal censorship by this time had also collapsed in the year 1788. We talked about royal censorship last time. That was pretty much gone. The French government simply no longer had the financial resources to enforce censorship of the press. So now there was tons of public debate about the election of the Estates General and all the various deputies, and the various grievances printed in pamphlets all over the place. And there was a huge amount of open public interest and excitement and anticipation and discussion about what was going to happen when this new Estates General would finally meet and take action on all these crushing problems like debt and unemployment and the price of bread. The most important and exciting of these pamphlets was by a priest named Abbé Sieyes, and it really got people talking. And the pamphlet was called, What is the Third Estate? And in this pamphlet, Abbé Sieyes did three things. Number one, Sieyes attacked privilege. His answer to the title question was the Third Estate was everything. The Third Estate was where the commerce and the industry and the lifeblood of France were. The other two estates were just useless consumers and even, using his word, foreigners, compared to the Third Estate, the true nation. If the Third Estate was the true nation, then technically, by that logic, the First and Second Estates would be foreigners, wouldn't they? Second thing Sieyes did was he also redefined sovereignty. The Third Estate was the true nation. The Third Estate was where the sovereignty of the nation was, not with the king. Sovereignty was with the individual French citizens, represented by deputies, governed by law. And this was a direct challenge to the sovereignty of the king, who famously showed his attitude about sovereignty by once saying about tax reform, "It is legal because I will it." The third thing that Sieyes did was that he challenged the traditional voting structure in the upcoming Estates General. The king had already agreed to let the Third Estate have twice as many deputies as each of the other two estates. Traditionally, Each estate would first meet on its own as an individual estate, decide how it wanted to vote as an estate on a particular issue. And then the three estates would meet together in the Estates General, and each estate would get one vote. And this meant that the clergy and the nobility could always protect their system of privilege by outvoting the third estate 2-1. But Abbé Sieyes argued that the vote of each individual deputy should count equally when all three estates met together as well. This would make the third estate much more powerful in that Estates General than either of the other two, since they had by far the highest number of representatives. And if that happened, then the first and second estates could no longer protect their privileges by outvoting the third estate. And the hierarchical system of privilege that the nobility and the clergy had enjoyed for so long would begin to break down, as the third estate would pass laws that would slowly chip away at those privileges. And in Sieyes' pamphlet, you can see the individual becoming more important in French thinking. But what about these approximately 500 grievance lists? Well, these lists, collected from different types of peoples all over France, contain literally thousands upon thousands of complaints and opinions and concerns and suggestions and petitions and agendas about the issues that impacted their daily lives. And many of their grievances reflected the fear of starvation created by the recent bad harvests. But they had three main points in common. Number one, they opposed noble privilege. Number two, they attacked the wealth of the church. And number three, they called for more equality in the tax system. And they tended not to attack the king himself. Overwhelmingly, the French really wanted to love their king. Instead, they begged the king to be ready to help them by reforming all of France through this coming Estates General. The Estates General met on May 5th, 1789. They met in a giant, beautifully refurbished hall at Versailles. All the important people of France were there, including the king and Marie Antoinette. And an audience of 2,000 filled the balconies. And Jacques Necker had been recently reappointed as finance minister, and he was viewed as the man with the plan, the hero of the people. And Necker gave a highly technical speech that lasted 3 hours. And everybody expected to hear how he was going to save the day. And at the end of that 3-hour speech, after all the pageantry and preparation and ceremony and anticipation, it was obvious to everybody that there was no plan or idea at all for solving the crisis or reforming France. The formation of the National Assembly. In the story of the French Revolution, you hear about the Estates General, and then you start hearing about this other thing called the National Assembly. What was it? How did it emerge? And how was it different from the Estates General? And it was basically the same guys, by the way. So what did the difference between the two mean for the nation of France? The next day, after Finance Minister Jacques Necker's speech, the Estates General met to get down to business. The first and second estates had about 300 representatives each. The third estate had about 600 representatives, and these representatives were called deputies. None of them, not one, had any experience in national representative politics. Where would they get that experience? So every single deputy in that hall was learning on the job. Imagine our U.S. Congress meeting, and not a single one of its 535 members had ever done national legislation before. Maybe that's not so hard to imagine. There were actually 4 meeting halls for the Estates General. Each estate had its own meeting hall, and then there was a main hall where all 3 estates met together. And the Estates General deadlocked on their very first task. The king instructed the 3 estates to go to their individual meeting halls and verify their memberships. Sounds simple enough. If you have 3 membership rosters, one for each of the 3 estates, it's going to be very easy to do a one estate, one vote procedure. You simply vote by roster. But if everyone's membership is verified together on one single roster, it's going to be very difficult to separate out 1,200 names by estate and figure out how each estate is voting. You're going to have to default to a one-man, one-vote procedure if there is just one unified roster. So the question of how to verify membership in separate estates or all together may seem like a minor procedural thing, but in reality, it meant everything. The Third Estate representatives were ready for this power play, and they refused to leave the main meeting hall. They knew that if each estate verified its membership separately, it would be very easy to make the voting one estate, one vote. And they knew that if that happened, the first and second estates would dominate the third estate. And they knew that if that happened, then privilege and hierarchy would triumph over reform and equality. There'd be no reform, and there'd be no solution to this economic crisis. For weeks, the Estates General did nothing but chatter and argue and shout at each other about membership verification. And the first and second estates became more and more entrenched. The king's son, a child, was actually on the edge of death from tuberculosis, so the king wasn't providing any leadership. On June the 17th, 1789, the Third Estates Assembly made a radical declaration. They declared that their assembly represented the entire nation of France, not just their estate. You can kind of see where they're getting that idea from Abbé Sieyes. Well, this was a revolutionary act. They settled on a new name that would reflect this assertion: the National Assembly. No longer the Third Estate, the National Assembly. When King Louis XVI heard about it, his response was, "It's just a phrase." Well, how do you make this transfer of sovereignty away from the king and towards them a reality instead of just a phrase? Well, the National Assembly announced that it would take responsibility for that massive monster national debt, and they announced that they would take responsibility for collecting taxes. And this made the new National Assembly responsible for solving the financial crisis. And it also made it responsible for any reforms necessary for solving the financial crisis. So what was this historic tennis court oath that you're always hearing about? Well, on June the 20th, 1789, the commoners of this new National Assembly, as the Third Estate was now calling itself, went to its meeting hall in Versailles. And the meeting hall was locked and guarded. And they feared that the king was making some kind of a move to shut them down, and so they moved over to a nearby indoor tennis court. And this indoor tennis court was big. It had room for seating spectators, etc. And every member of this new National Assembly took an oath. They swore that they would not disband until a new constitution was written for France. They would not let anyone stop them from meeting. Of all the most emotional and dramatic moments in our entire course, this one approaches the top. And this would be called the tennis court oath. This oath would be severely tested in just 3 days. On June 23rd, King Louis XVI showed up, and he called the three estates together in the main hall. And of course, the Third Estate was now calling itself the National Assembly and was claiming sovereignty over all of France. And the king declared that there was no National Assembly. There was an Estates General, and you represent the Third Estate and just the Third Estate. And he declared that there would be no changes to noble privilege, church tithes, or noble dues. He did, however, acknowledge that there was a financial crisis, and he did agree to listen to the Estates General, but only through a select committee of elites. Then the king had his master of ceremonies tell all three estates to get out and go to their separate meeting places and come back to the main hall when they were called. One of the leaders of the National Assembly, Gabriel de Comte Mirabeau, stood up and shouted, "We're not leaving. We represent the nation, and we are only leaving at the point of a bayonet." By the way, Mirabeau had a history all of his own. He was actually born a high noble. He considered his nobility worthless to him, and he was at the Estates General as a representative of the Third Estate. So the First and the Second Estates went to their own meeting halls, and the Third Estate, now known as the National Assembly, stayed and occupied the main meeting hall, and it was a standoff. Except that over the next 3 days, some members of the clergy started kind of going over to the National Assembly, and then 47 nobles, led by the king's own cousin, did the same thing from their assembly. On June 27th, King Louis XVI gave in, and he recognized the authority of the National Assembly. And he told the First and Second Estates to join the National Assembly, not as representatives of their estates, but as individual representatives. The Estates General no longer existed. It was now the National Assembly, in which every individual deputy had an equal vote. The National Assembly had won the right to exist and run France. And when the people of Paris heard about this, they celebrated with fireworks. It looked like the king had given in, but he was also assembling 30,000 troops outside Versailles. And these royal troops could crush the National Assembly at Versailles, or they could turn and attack revolutionaries in the city of Paris. Paris and Versailles were only about 12 miles apart. Nobody knew what the king was going to do with that 30,000-man army. And in addition to all that, the economic crisis, one of our central themes, was getting worse by the day. The price of bread was going up. There were grain riots all over France, and troops had to protect supply convoys from being attacked and robbed. The storming of the Bastille. The Bastille was always one of those so whats for me. I mean, why is Bastille Day the French national holiday? Why was this one prison so important and so full of meaning? Why did the people of Paris storm the Bastille in the first place? And why did the storming of the Bastille have so many other effects? The Bastille was a massive royal prison in Paris. Its walls were 79 feet high. It had originally been built as a fortress rather than as a prison, had a couple of huge drawbridges for protection, and for the French, the Bastille represented the arbitrary, unjust, evil, despotic, and tyrannical actions of the king. We talked about how many writers and publishers were imprisoned at the Bastille. Voltaire had been imprisoned there twice. And what do you think all these people wrote and published about when they got out of there? About their experiences, of course. So the Bastille had a reputation. The Bastille was the state prison for all of the king's enemies, especially writers. He could put them in there without a trial. So the Bastille also represented censorship and thought control. And they didn't just lock people up in there. All of the Enlightenment books that we have talked about were locked up as inanimate prisoners themselves in the Bastille when they were confiscated. The Bastille, like the monarchy, was surrounded by secrecy and mystery. Carriages would bring in prisoners with the curtains down. Guards faced the other way so they didn't even know who the prisoners were. Jailers were forbidden from speaking to the prisoners. And even the reason for an arrest was often a secret. The Man in the Iron Mask took place at the Bastille, if you know that story. By 1789, however, things had improved somewhat at the Bastille. The worst, most rat-infested dungeons were no longer used. If you had money, you could buy your own food. You could eat at the Bastille better than the free poor people of Paris did. On July the 14th, there were only 7 prisoners in the Bastille. 4 were forgers. There was 1 failed assassin. There was 1 old molester who had been charged by his own family. And there was 1 deluded crazy person who thought he was Jesus. But when a French person thought of the Bastille, like I said, he thought of concepts like injustice, tyranny, evil, censorship, secrecy, power politics, no trial, no rule of law, all coming directly from the crown. The Bastille also stood in the middle of Paris's poorest neighborhood. So the poorest, hungriest, most downtrodden people in all of Paris got to look at this massive symbol of all of their troubles every single day. Keep in mind the impact of recent events we've talked about. The representatives of the Third Estate in the Estates General had rebelled against the old legislative system. The Third Estate had converted the Estates General into the National Assembly, with themselves as the most numerous faction within it. They had even gotten many deputies of the other two estates to join their cause. The king had been forced to acknowledge the legitimacy and the power of this new National Assembly, and many thought that the French Revolution was now complete. But King Louis XVI had this huge army out there near Versailles and near Paris, and about 5,000 royal troops and foreign mercenaries were camped out right where the Eiffel Tower stands today. And the people of Paris were extremely suspicious of the king's plan with this army. Well, the reality was that indecisiveness was Louis XVI's biggest character flaw, and he didn't have a plan. He didn't know what he was going to do with all those troops. The people of Paris were watching these developments hopefully. They were hungry for justice and fairness and reform, but more than anything else, they were hungry for food. We've talked about how bad the grain harvest was in 1788. Drought, hailstorms, heavy rainfall had all taken their toll. The price of bread had doubled, and the flour in the bread was absolutely disgusting and nasty and smelly. And people weren't just hungry, they were fearful. Starving to death in a famine was a tough way to go. Rumors drove developments around the storming of the Bastille. There were rumors that aristocrats were hoarding all the grain for themselves. And one of these rumors was that Marie Antoinette had said, "Let 'em eat cake." Well, that rumor was false. She never said that. But we've talked about how Marie Antoinette had a big public image problem. We don't usually think of bread as a hot political issue. But in 1789, the price of bread was topic number one in French politics. And we saw this reflected in the grievance lists of the people. That's what happens when you haven't eaten anything for 2 days. The people of Paris had two hopes for getting the price of bread down. One was the National Assembly, and the other was Jacques Necker, the king's finance minister. They saw him as the people's protector. They saw him as the guy who could bring grain to Paris. And people thought that it was he who had gotten the king to recognize the National Assembly. People thought that without him as a check on the king's conscience, Louis XVI might do who knows what to the National Assembly. So on July 11th, when the king fired Jacques Necker from his job as finance minister, it caused all kinds of suspicion in Paris. It looked like the king was getting ready to do something drastic, and he didn't want to deal with Jacques Necker about it. So people poured into the streets and they chanted Jacques Necker's name, and they listened to speeches against the king, and they were all getting really stirred up. A new citizens' militia was formed, and crowds scoured the streets of Paris looking for grain, weapons, and ammo to defend the city. More rumors drove the unrest, that the Bastille had been ordered to point its cannons at the surrounding neighborhood, that the members of the National Assembly had already been arrested and had been taken to the Bastille. The storming of the Bastille did not happen spontaneously. Between the firing of Jacques Necker and July 14th, the unrest was building and building. Parisians ransacked a large monastery looking for grain. They started freeing the prisoners from various prisons in town. They raided an armory and got 40,000 guns and 12 cannons. However, there was no gunpowder for all of these weapons. Rumors went around that all the gunpowder had been secretly moved to the Bastille, and this was easy to believe. The Bastille was a highly secretive place. The governor of the Bastille was Bernard René Delaunay, and he commanded a little over 100 men and about 30 cannons. So the leaders of Paris wanted that gunpowder, and they sent a delegation to meet with Delaunay to work things out peacefully over lunch. However, they couldn't come to an agreement. Meanwhile, a huge crowd was building all around the Bastille. Most of these people had homemade weapons, and we talked about how the Bastille was a massive building in the middle of a poor, crowded neighborhood, and shops and houses were built right up against the Bastille's walls and ramparts. They would literally use the Bastille as their back walls. And so some members of the crowd climbed to the roof of one of these shops, a perfume shop, and got into the outer courtyard of the Bastille. And they hacked through the pulleys of the huge drawbridge, and that drawbridge came crashing down onto the street. Nobody knows who ordered it, but a cannon shot and a volley of rifle shots were fired from inside the courtyard through the gate where the drawbridge had just crashed down and into the crowd in front of the prison. To the crowd, it looked like Delaunay had deliberately released the drawbridge in order to ambush the crowd. So in anger, the people started to attack over that drawbridge, and the fight was on. Delaunay's men held off the attack for hours. The attackers weren't as well armed as the defenders, and when you're defending, a draw is as good as a win. It's really incumbent upon the attacker to make something happen. The people of Paris were really determined to make something happen that day, and one of the things they tried was bringing up wagons full of straw and setting them on fire to create a smoke screen for the attackers. One militiaman from this new citizens' militia went out to the royal troops and convinced 70 of them to bring 5 cannons to fire at the Bastille. Don't know how he did that. The cannonballs just bounced off the walls of the Bastille without doing much of anything. Nevertheless, here were royal troops helping the people of Paris storm a royal prison. Here's what finally tipped the balance for the attackers. These royal troops lined their cannon up in front of that already lowered drawbridge and got ready to fire through the open outer gate to knock down the inner gates and expose the inner courtyard. And this was going to take the fighting to a whole new level of intensity. And Delaunay knew that he was going to have to inflict heavy casualties in order to stop those cannons. And he knew that he was being attacked by royal troops. So at first, Delaunay announced, "I'll just blow up the entire Bastille and go out in a blaze of glory and take the neighborhood out with me." Delaunay's own men convinced him not to do that, so Delaunay surrendered and gave himself up instead. And the leaders of Paris tried to march Delaunay to the town hall, but the crowd was very hostile, and Delaunay tried to kick one of the members of the mob, and they just went out of control and jumped him and killed him, and then they savagely cut his head off right there on the street. Casualties of the Bastille. The defenders had 1 killed and 3 wounded. The attackers had almost 100 killed and 73 wounded. 954 people were identified and given the lifelong title Conqueror of the Bastille. One of those 954, only one, was a woman. This distinction was kind of like, the honor of being called, let's say, a first responder from 9/11 or something. You're a hero. So what was the king doing on Bastille Day? No surprise. He loved it. He was out hunting all day. And that night, one of the king's servants came to bring him a nightcap, and he mentioned the fall of the Bastille. And the king asked, "Is it a rebellion?" And the servant said, "No, sire, it's a revolution." It's kind of like the Battle of Yorktown, which ended the American Revolution, which you learned about in 8th grade. There was nothing official that said victory at Yorktown was going to end the American Revolution. In fact, intense fighting continued for some time after the Battle of Yorktown. But everyone knew that Yorktown was going to seal the deal. A lot of nobles understood that the storming of the Bastille was a revolution. Many nobles started to leave France immediately, and this included the king's own brother. After the Bastille fell, several things were now clear to everyone. Number one, the city of Paris, the capital, the heart of France, was in complete support of this revolution. Number two, royal troops were also in support of this revolution. And number three, it established this repeating pattern that you will see again and again. Paris would push the revolution forward. People in the streets would make it more radical than it otherwise would have been. And to this day, protest and resistance are considered every French person's patriotic duty. In late July, other peasant uprisings and urban uprisings occurred all over France. Merchants and professionals, non-nobles, seized power in towns all over France. They set up permanent committees to run things. They set up volunteer militias, and these militias got thousands and thousands of young men participating in and learning about politics and revolution. Paris got a new government and a new mayor. And this new government was called a commune. It got a new leader for its citizen militia, George Washington's young protege from 8th grade history, the Marquis de Lafayette. He knew something about revolution, having fought in the American Revolution, and this citizens' militia would take the name the National Guard. With the fall of the Bastille, all of the worst things about the monarchy that the Bastille represented in the minds of the French also began to fall, and this cemented the authority of the National Assembly. All those concepts were now targets for the National Assembly to reverse. Before the Bastille, the king had simply been forced to recognize the National Assembly, but now the king also had to promise to work with the National Assembly to bring about change. Within a few weeks, the National Assembly would end such privileges as dues and tithes, as well as write the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. By July 16th, the king had withdrawn his army. He couldn't count on them anyway. And also by July 16th, the king reappointed Jacques Necker to finance minister. And on July 17th, the king went to Paris and took part in a public ceremony in which he embraced the symbols of the revolution, which we'll talk about. On July 15th, the very day after the storming of the Bastille, a construction contractor named Pierre Palloy showed up at the Bastille with about 800 men. And he started tearing the Bastille down, stone by stone. The demolition took months to complete. Palloy sent pieces of the Bastille all over France. Every town and village had pieces of the Bastille on display. Some pieces were even embedded in churches. Thousands of stones were carved into models of the Bastille and marketed as relics of freedom. Metal chains from the Bastille were made into memorial items like ink pots and snuff boxes and paperweights and keychains. Lafayette, the new leader of this new Paris National Guard and a deputy in the National Assembly, sent a key from the Bastille across the Atlantic to his old beloved mentor, George Washington, who was serving as our first president of the United States. And if you visit George Washington's plantation, Mount Vernon, today, where he owned slaves, you won't find any slaves working there. But that key from the Bastille is still on display to this day. And below is a YouTube link about it. The Abolition of Feudalism on August 4th, 1789. This is normally when we talk about the Great Fear. And the Great Fear is something that teachers traditionally talk about, but they have a hard time explaining it. Teachers are unclear on why it happened. They're unclear on what it caused later. So here's an attempt to fill in the gap. Any political revolution can go 2 steps or just 1 step. It can be just a political revolution. Political power changes hands. Our American Revolution was essentially that, although it was based upon principles that put our country on a moral path toward major social change many decades later. Or a political revolution can also go much further than just political change. It can change all of society from top to bottom. And on August 4th, 1789, the French Revolution made that crucial transition from being just political to being social as well. How did that happen? That transition is the significance of that story of the Great Fear. The Great Fear was a nationwide rural peasant panic that took place from July 20th to August 6th, 1789. The rural peasants of France had already filled out the grievance lists that we've talked about. Those grievances were on their minds. Why did the Great Fear happen? There were 4 factors. Number 1, fear of hunger. People thought that there was an aristocratic plot among the lords and merchants and tax collectors to hoard grain and drive the prices up. And this was fueled by the firing of Jacques Necker. Necker was already rehired by the time the Great Fear started, but news traveled at about 5 to 6 miles an hour at this time. News made it to peasant villages even more slowly, and about 2/3 of the people didn't even speak French. That's a surprise. They spoke some regional dialect instead. Number 2, fear of bandits and vagabonds. Peasants were seeing more of these everywhere than ever before. Peasants thought that local lords were hiring them to steal their grain before they could harvest it. And people also feared an invading army. They knew that many French nobles had left France, and some thought that these nobles were organizing for an invasion of France to reestablish the old regime. Number 3, anger at the aristocrats. They seemed to be the common denominator. Hunger, bandits, invasion, etc. Aristocrats seemed to be at the center of all these other fears. The 4th cause, revolutionary politics. Now, I know what you're thinking. How did all these fears connect with and intermingle with revolutionary politics? Well, here's the answer. The rural peasants wanted a government that would protect their food supply from all those aristocrats whose legal privileges seemed to allow them to do whatever they wanted and take whatever they wanted with impunity. Once again, rumors touched off anti-noble revolts. Peasants stormed and looted their houses. They tore down their weather vanes. They tossed furniture out their windows. They burned documents that listed their lord's feudal rights. They trashed the lord's private pews in the churches. They raided monastery cellars and took their wine and their cognac. They cooked and ate their lord's pigeons. Dovecotes, which are homes for pigeons, were an important food supply, and peasants were often not allowed to have them because they're peasants. If the lord was there, you could place him or her under citizen's arrest and kind of rough him up a bit, scare him, humiliate him, make him sign away his rights. Nobles tended not to be killed or seriously injured in the Great Fear. On August the 4th, the National Assembly hatched a plan to calm the rural peasant unrest. Their plan worked, but it went way beyond what the Assembly ever expected. The plan was to have some of the more liberal noble deputies get up and renounce some of their privileges. And the idea was to throw the peasants a bone with some modest changes to privilege. And then news of that would get out to the peasants and it would quell the unrest. But the plan spiraled out of control in one single night. At first, the plan went according to script. A few nobles got up before the assembly and renounced their privileges in support of the peasants of France. But soon, it touched off this chain reaction of nobles spontaneously giving up their privileges, denouncing feudalism, declaring support for the peasants, and proposing sweeping changes to the entire system of privilege in France. That evening became a frenzy of generosity, and at times it was a competition to see who could be the most generous. Other times it seemed like kind of a tit-for-tat situation. For example, a clergyman might propose that nobles give up exclusive hunting rights. And then, in retaliation, the nobleman would counterpropose that the church give up a certain pastoral feast day that the peasants had to provide. And this went on all night long. Hundreds of nobles took part. One deputy described what was happening this way: the French nobility is committing suicide. The psychology behind this night of August 4th is a mystery. Was it fear or guilt or optimism or idealism or generosity or enthusiasm, a sense of brotherhood? Was it national pride, or was it a mix of emotions? Historians are not sure. The National Assembly spent August 5th through the 11th formally writing the fervor of that night into law. Some proposals were toned down a bit. Some nobles were not at all happy about what had taken place. Many nobles had been happy about it in the excitement of the moment, but then regretted it later. Here are the major proclamations that the National Assembly made on August 4th. Number 1, abolition of feudal dues. Lords could no longer collect fees for using the communal grain mill, the wine press, the bread ovens, etc. All the things that peasants had to use that the lords owned. Number 2, no more noble courts of justice. Nobles up to this point could have their own court systems called seigneurial courts. 3, no more exclusive dovecotes or hunting privileges. 4, all remaining vestiges of serfdom were abolished. 5, no more unpaid labor from peasants. 6, the abolition of church tithes was passed, quote, in principle. Took a couple of years before it would actually be for real. 7, government bureaucratic jobs would be awarded based upon merit rather than based upon birth or privilege. No more buying and selling of government offices. 8, any commoner could be an officer in the army. And 9, any commoner could hold a high church position. Here are some propositions to the National Assembly that did not pass. That's important too. What stayed the same? Complete religious freedom for all Protestants did not pass. The abolition of slavery, proposed but did not pass. And abolishing the noble class entirely, that did not pass. King Louis XVI was totally disgusted by the August 4th decrees. He swore never to agree to these decrees, and for several months, King Louis XVI refused to sign off on them. But the August 4th decrees created deeper factions within the National Assembly, and a new political party formed called the Monarchiens, monarchists, people who supported the monarch. This group believed that France would be better off with a strong king and a ruling circle of elites. They pushed for two things to be in this new constitution that the National Assembly was now putting together. Number 1, absolute veto power for the king. Right? The king could veto any measure he wanted to. And number 2, a legislature with 2 houses, a lower one and an upper one. The more liberal deputies didn't like either of those two things. Absolute veto power would make the king too powerful, and a 2-house legislature would create 1 house of elites. The National Assembly currently had just 1 house, and all the deputies met together as one body, regardless of which estate they belonged to, noble, clergy, or common. But let's compare this to our own U.S. Constitution. Our president has veto power, but it's not absolute veto power. It's limited. Congress can override his veto if they have enough votes. Our Constitution specifies an upper house, the Senate, and a lower house, the House of Representatives. And the Senate is definitely more elite and more exclusive than the House of Representatives. You have to be older to be a member of the Senate. There are only 100 senators versus 435 representatives in the House. And once elected, a senator is in there for 6 years before he has to run for re-election. Congressman has to run for office again every 2 years. So a senator has much more time to entrench himself in power before the voters can check him. So at the end of the day, the monarchists, they didn't get either of these two things. Around France, it became very un-French and too aristocratic to dress too flashy. Nobles and clergy complained that peasants no longer treated them with the normal deference that they used to. Peasants were supposed to pay compensation to their lords, who could no longer charge them dues and fees, give them, they're supposed to get some amount of money in compensation for that. But many peasants refused to pay this. And the landlord-tenant relationship became based solely upon rent and nothing else. Church tithes were finally eliminated in 1791, and this was mostly because the state took on the responsibility for paying priests. The Great Fear and the August 4th Decree's response to the Great Fear showed two important things about the French Revolution. Number one, it showed that popular action had a direct impact on the laws that were being written and the form of government that was developing. This had been shown by the urban workers storming the Bastille, and it was now shown again by the rural peasants in the Great Fear uprising. Number two, it showed that the French Revolution was now a social revolution and not just a political revolution.